Clients are always fascinated when we change the haptic feedback of our HAPTICORE encoders with a push of a button. One of the most impressive features is the barrier, which, depending on the HAPTICORE we are using, feels absolutely natural and mechanical. But it all comes from our software. So, hi, and welcome to another video about our HAPTICORE software solutions. This time, we're talking about the barrier function, about everything you need to know to create your own haptic feedback patterns with barriers, how to combine, for example, ticks and a barrier, and what you need to pay attention to. Finally, we'll go a bit further and create a more complex new haptic feedback mode. For this video, you should have already watched our first steps guide and our ticks video. Since this video is part of a series about our HAPTICORE software solution, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any announcements and new videos. And leave us a like if you find this video useful. But now, let's start and create our own barrier. If you're coming from our tick video, then we're continuing right here at the tick functions window, as we want to combine ticks and a barrier later on. Therefore, we reset the tick function and activate the tick mode 4, so that we are ready to start. Short reminder about tick mode 4, applying the current in a sinus curve shape centered over the individual ticks, automatically setting the tick window and switching between negative and positive current. If you haven't seen the video about the ticks yet, you should definitely watch it, or read the description of the customer test set in the download folder. But now, let's get started. Tick mode 4, 24 degrees, 80 milliamps, and velocity factor of 0.1. So now we head over to the barrier section. We deactivate the ticks and activate the barrier instead, so that we can feel the haptic feedback that we create now. In the barrier section, you can find some new settings, starting with the start and stop angle. By default, this is set to minus 90 degrees for the counterclockwise rotation and plus 90 degrees for clockwise rotation. This results in a total action radius of 180 degrees. Of course, our ripples also show us where our encoder is currently located. However, we see here that our encoder is at plus 390 degrees, clearly outside the defined range. What our customer test app does now is that it locks us in the clockwise direction and only allows the rotation in the direction towards the corridor. To actually get into our defined range, we could of course just turn the encoder backward. But if we have rotated a lot before, we have to turn quite a bit here. Therefore, we make life a little easier and use the encoder settings. Set the total encoder angle to 0 degrees, and with one click, we are in the middle of our corridor. Now we can rotate the encoder in both directions until we feel our barrier at plus and minus 90 degrees. Basically, we recommend you to keep the default settings here. You can theoretically adjust the strength of the barrier and, for example, reduce it. The same applies to the holding current, which is the strength that is applied to the coil without turning the encoder right at the end of the barrier. But these are usually perfectly set by default. More important, however, is the barrier polarity. As briefly mentioned at the beginning of the video, tick mode 4 switches between positive and negative current to demagnetize the encoder for better haptic feedback. We need to keep these changes between the ticks in mind and set the barrier polarity accordingly. This is better illustrated by the following figure. Here you can see that for ticks with a distance of 24 degrees and a barrier at 0 and 96 degrees, we start and stop in the positive polarity range at the beginning of our barrier. Therefore, we set our polarity for start and stop to positive. Now, if we change the barrier, for example, to 72 degrees and take out one tick, we notice when we turn the HAPTICORE that the barrier feels a bit sticky or unclean. This is because we have now placed our barrier at the point where the haptic feedback is generated by a negative current. This creates a strong jump from negative to positive, which creates this unclean haptic feedback. However, we can easily solve this problem by setting the polarity for the stop to negative and thus generate clean haptic feedback with noticeable ticks and a barrier at 0 and 72 degrees. As the force of the barrier depends on the encoder we use, the term barrier does not necessarily mean that we cannot force the encoder to rotate beyond the generated limits. In our case, for example, the HAPTICORE Mini is designed for single-finger application, but with some extra force, we can get outside the corridor we defined. This is indicated by the total encoder angle. To deactivate this, at least software-based, we activate the function barrier limit angle. And as you can see, our total encoder angle jumps directly back to the barrier stop we defined at 72 degrees. But what exactly happens now? The function has no effect on the strength of the barrier, but within the customer test app, it no longer allows the encoder angle to leave the defined corridor. This means that we no longer have to turn the encoder back until we are within the barrier area after moving outside the barrier, but instead remain at the end of the barrier despite further rotating, and we start directly within the corridor again when rotating in the opposite direction, in which we feel our created ticks. We can now modify our barrier corridor even further. To do this, we switch once again to the ticks function. Our goal is to make the ticks only perceivable for a certain range within the corridor. We can achieve this with a tick start and tick stop angle, which work just like the barrier angles. Again, it is important that we define the tick angle precisely and to keep the polarity in mind. If we want to generate 3 ticks, for example, then with a tick angle of 24 degrees, we have the first tick at 0, the second tick at 24, and the third tick at 48 degrees. So that's also the stop angle we put in here. And right after that, we feel our ticks between 0 and 48 degrees, and no more haptic feedback in the range from 48 degrees up to our barrier at 72 degrees. However, when you turn your encoder, you might notice that the third tick at 48 degrees feels a bit different than the other 2 ticks. To understand what is happening here, let's take a look at our illustration again. So far, the tick has ended right at the barrier, resulting in a clean haptic feedback. However, if we now change the tick stop angle to 48 degrees, we cut our third tick right in the middle, causing a rapid current drop at 48 degrees. In tick mode 4, which automatically generates the tick window, this means that we have to add 12 degrees, half of our tick angle, to complete the whole tick, including its tick window. Therefore, we don't use 48, but instead 60 degrees as the stop angle to generate homogeneous ticks within the defined range. So now you feel 3 perfect ticks, an area where we don't feel any haptic feedback, and our barriers at 0 and 72 degrees. Now that we have programmed the ticks correctly, we could of course increase the range with no haptic feedback and set our barrier angle to, let's say, 180 degrees instead. After all these modifications, we of course want to save our new haptic feedback mode. To do this, as you know from our first steps guide, we click Add New Haptic Mode right over here, give our mode a name, and save our custom barrier mode with ticks. Okay, that was a quite complex session. If you didn't understand everything the first time, just rewind and go through the steps again. Are you ready for the next session? Then continue with one of the other videos on our channel. And if you think you should better repeat the basics, then go back to the first steps video. And of course, if you have any questions about our software solutions or our HAPTICORE products, do not hesitate to get in touch with us. Otherwise, we would be happy if you leave us a like and subscribe to our channel, so you don't miss any announcements and new videos. But for now, have fun trying out our HAPTICORE technology and see you in the next video.